ゲームじゃない感じに仕上げたいっていうような、ゲームなんですけど、ゲームやってたっていう感じよりもなんか違うものが残ってほしいなっていうような、感覚ですかね。僕ほら、例えばゲームっていろんなものがあるし、スポーツゲームもあれば、パズルみたいなのもあるしっていう、そういうものの、なんていう要素をもう何でもかんでも吸収しちゃうようなゲームなところがあるので、ゲームをしてるんだけれども、いろんなことの体験をしてって最後にその物語全部が集約し、一つ終わりを迎えるみたいな、そういうような遊びともつかないしゲームともつかないし、何だったんだろうこれは、なんかその疑似体験としてなんか面白いものを経験しちゃったなみたいな、そういう感覚で終われるものになってくれればいいなといつも思ってますね。だからゼルダは何でも吸収できるし、何をやってもゼルダとも言えるし、うまいことをやらないとゼルダと言ってもらえないみたいな変な側面もあるし、なんかね、変な不思議なゲームです。はい。
Eiji Aonuma's 5 directed Zelda games are a very over-discussed topic, like, in general. For reasons that we're going to get into, it's important to a lot of people to control the narrative about them, which you might also suspect this video is going to be an attempt at. What I would say is that these games are not perfect. They've got filler and problems. Even if they didn't, the medium is still very young, so making grand declarations about it wouldn't be enduring or impressive. So for the longest time, I never felt the need to say anything. But I realize now that most Zelda fans understand small surface level things, but in the end, they just can't see the forest for the trees. The director's intended interpretation ends up getting the same amount of focus and respect that some fan theory would. They like it, they think it's fun, but optional. Some people still believe it to be unfounded. Nobody's as angry as they really should be. They seem to think that everyone is just entitled to their opinion, which is textbook cowardice. I thought that I could organize things a little better, but I really can't afford to. I promise by the end of it, I really do address everything, but I won't explain it in ludicrous detail, because I'm not trying to sell you on a stupid fan theory. None of this is a theory. It's not apologetic in any way, and it isn't my opinion poorly disguised as a retrospective. This is simply The Legend of Zelda as it was intended by Eiji Aonuma. Now, before I say anything about anything, I need to address all the common misconceptions that I possibly can. For Zelda, the very best source of misconceptions is Matthew Matosis, a painfully condescending YouTube critic.
The story sets itself up to be a prequel to every other Zelda game to date, but doesn't accomplish anything with it. The most shocking revelation in the game is that Zelda is actually the reincarnated form of the goddess Hylia, a character who had never even been mentioned before until the intro to Skyward Sword.
Starting with the basics, the very first Zelda timeline can be found all the way back in 1991 in this Famitsu article. A Link to the Past is mostly Takashi Tezuka's game, but the first manual was penned by Koizumi, who would later direct the first 3D Mario titles. This was just before Aonuma was officially hired, and in the manual you get to see a lot of different things that Koizumi and Aonuma would eventually work on together in their earliest forms. But I'll just show the timeline here first.
Okay, so you've got Zelda 3 at the top, and then it says the original Zelda makes her first appearance. And then it also says Link's ancestor, ? Then after that it just says Nagai Nengetsu, I think, which is just like a long period of years and months. That's all it is.
It's interesting here that Koizumi is saying A Link to the Past is a time jump prequel to Zelda 1. Aonuma must have really loved this idea, because when he was brought on, he repeated it. Twice. When we get into later the boundaries of Aonuma's creative control, this will be an important thing to go back over because it shows the line between what he inherited and how he retooled it to fit his purposes. In 2002, following the release of The Wind Waker, Aonuma would give this quote in a GamePro article. The GamePro article itself is lost to time from what I can tell, but it's been archived in this issue of Nintendo Power. Where does The Wind Waker fit in the overall Legend of Zelda timeline? In terms of the storyline, we've decided that this takes place 100 years after the events in Ocarina of Time. We think that as you play through the game, you'll notice that the beginning of the story explains some of the events in Ocarina of Time. You'll also find hints of things from Ocarina of Time that exist in The Wind Waker. There's also a more complicated explanation. If you think back to the end of Ocarina of Time, there were two endings in that game in different time periods. First, Link defeated Ganon as an adult, and then he actually went back to being a child. You could say that The Wind Waker takes place 100 years after the ending in which Link was an adult. Now that's pretty descriptive on its own, but if you need proof of his consistency on this issue, he says a similar thing in an interview he gave to Nindry in 2006 to coincide with the release of Twilight Princess. Fair warning, I can't read Japanese, and Google Translate doesn't handle it very well. Windtact is parallel. Isn't it back to the childhood when Link flies to the world 7 years later at Ocarina and defeats Ganon? Twilight Princess is a world 100 and several years after a peaceful childhood. In the last scene of Ocarina of Time, Link and Princess Zelda come back as children to have a conversation. It is this story that the story's result is a little dragging that the relationship between the three with Ganon goes in different directions. In the middle of the work, there's a scene where Ganon is executed. If you leave him alone, he will be executed because he is a sacker to do ridiculous things later. So that scene is a few years after Ocarina. So the executed Ganon was sent to a world, and this time trying to get that power. There's plenty of old message boards of people reacting to the Famitsu article getting published elsewhere, most famous of which is AVGN's video, which he published on Cinemassacre.com in 2009. It's so weird to me that timeline deniers nowadays try to retroactively say that the chronology was somehow made up for Hyrule Historia in 2011. It's something that Aonuma had discussed for 2 decades at that point, and everybody else at the time was clamoring about it. It's probably the easiest lie to disprove that you could think of. I also found a Reddit post showing a magazine from October 2011 out of context in order to say that the timeline still isn't official. Meanwhile, Hyrule Historia released in December 2011. So it was a secret in October, but by December it was no longer a secret. I don't think that anyone actually bought this one, but I thought I would mention it while we're here because it's pretty funny.
At the start of the Minish Cap, there's an opening sequence detailing a previous incarnation of Link and shows that he wasn't wearing a hat. In the grander scheme of the Zelda timeline, the Minish Cap was basically an origin story for Link's hat, which was a fun idea. It was executed extremely well, and by the end of the game it was nice to know that the hats of the various Links worn through the years were a sort of unknowing tribute to Eslo. Skyward Sword undoes the entire point of this game. If Skyward Sword actually cared at all about being faithful to the timeline, then Link wouldn't be wearing a hat, which would have been an extremely easy change to make, and might have even made his design more interesting.
I won't get into this too much in this video because we're focusing on Eiji Aonuma's directed Zelda games and his story intentions for them. But yes, he does include games on his chronology that he had zero involvement in, and that much is a little confusing, understandably. I'm not going to say that these games aren't canon to each other, but if you think about it, or even if you don't, there's no possible way that these games could ever have any significant story connection. That's not what the timeline is about. The timeline is about how Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and Skyward Sword all would connect to Ocarina and Majora. As Eiji Aonuma developed his story, these were the only parts that he was really concerned about. There's 100-year time jumps between each hero, stretching 200 years, and the implication when you create any story with time jumps is that the events in between aren't significant. Nothing can happen after Ocarina of Time for a while because Ganon is sealed away, and etc., etc. So, these other games on the timeline, again, I'm not saying they aren't canon, but they are superfluous, which is supported by the fact that nobody ever mentions the Minish or Vadi or any of that stuff. None of this is confusing as long as you have a basic comprehension of time travel and you don't poke holes in it like a contrarian.
If they use the same logic as the Song of Storm scenario, then the plants would always be grown in the future because the game would assume that young Link would plant them in the past. If the Song of Storm scenario worked by the logic used on the plants, then the guy couldn't possibly have taught Link the song in the future until young Link played it in the past. Basically, all of this is to say that the time travel in Ocarina of Time probably wasn't thought out to a huge degree, and the developers simply went with whatever they thought was a good idea for certain parts of the game. When you look at the Magic Beans and the Song of Storms, they're both good ideas and I like the way they play with the time travel. The problem is they're incompatible with each other.
What Matthew really wants when he says that Minish Cap is a better prequel than Skyward Sword is for fans to be able to make creative changes to the story, and not the person directly responsible for that story. And well, that's problematic.
The reveal that Tetra is Zelda is perhaps the least thought out moment in any Zelda story ever. As soon as she's revealed to be the princess, the King of Red Lion starts referring to her as Zelda for no reason. Presumably names in the Zelda universe work the same way they do in the real world. Presumably Tetra has been going by the name Tetra for as long as she's been alive. It's even left ambiguous about whether or not she knew about her heritage at all, so why then is she suddenly renamed Zelda as soon as she discovers her lineage? This alone might not seem so bad, maybe we could assume that her name was Zelda all along and Tetra just an alias, but her clothes are suddenly replaced and she seems to undergo a complete personality change. She's no longer a freewheeling, aggressive pirate, but suddenly seems to be a refined, caring princess. Even if we go out on a limb and assume that Zelda's personality somehow awakened inside of Tetra, then that's a pretty terrible fate in and of itself. It's as though Tetra was just a vessel to be overwritten.
Okay, does it not occur to Matthew that just because an event takes place later in the story, that doesn't necessarily mean that the storyteller came up with it later? I mean, think about it. Even if you don't know anything about The Legend of Zelda, this information is obviously important to the ending of the game. And you can choose not to like that ending. It's a matter of personal taste. But can you really say with a straight face that Aonuma wasn't thinking about the ending of his story until the 11th hour? By definition, this can't be a shoehorn if that's what he always planned to do. I mean, it's made up. But everything's made up. So yeah, Tetra isn't real, Zelda isn't real. These are fictional stories. Again, what is this guy even talking about?
The more likely answer is this is simply a shoehorned reference to Ocarina of Time, one of many that are in the Wind Waker for seemingly no reason at all. There's no time travel in the Wind Waker, Link has no connection to the previous one apart from his clothes, the game doesn't even take place in Hyrule, not as we know it anyway. Overall, the references to the Hero of Time and all that stuff feel pretty forced, and the Koroks and the Rito are the two worst examples. The idea of setting a game and was essentially a post-apocalyptic scenario of Hyrule is wonderful, but its attempts to continue on from Ocarina of Time seem incredibly half-assed and not very well thought out.
It's pretty inappropriate to say that the races in Wind Waker need to have firmer connections to their Ocarina counterparts for it to be a fitting continuation of the story. They're loose on purpose. The old ways are lost to them, and they deliberately say as much in the intro to the game, which you skipped, by the way, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The moral and the whole point of the Wind Waker is that you should accept the past for what it is and build a better future. All the people, Hylians, Rito, Koroks, they've all shed their connections to the old world, and they live in peace above the waves, just as the gods wanted. Ganon insists that this was a cop-out and that the gods refused to save their people. But it's not true, they did what they could. Ganon's whole motivation in this game is to destroy the new world in wake of reviving the old one. He's protecting his heritage to the detriment of everyone else alive. You don't need an art book recapping that information to understand it. It's explicitly told to you in dialogue. And again, none of this is a fan theory, it's just what's in the games. Going back to what I said earlier about extraneous titles, Matt even complains about Phantom Hourglass for this very reason.
The ending to the game sees Hyrule washed away with the kids' future left in their own hands. We know now that the story continues on in two direct sequels to The Wind Waker, those being Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, but taken on its own, I think this would have made a fitting ending to the entire Zelda saga. Games could have still been set before The Wind Waker to allow the series to continue, and some are, but The Wind Waker itself would have made a nice conclusion to the series as a whole. Ganon, Hyrule and the Master Sword are all lost beneath the waves, and life moves on. It would have made for a nice ending.
He catches it here, but again, he's only applying this logic when it suits his opinion.
It would almost be as incredibly stupid as the King of Hyrule passionately telling the children at the end of The Wind Waker that their new land won't be Hyrule, because he wanted the past washed away, and then, within a few years, they discover a new continent, Guess what they call it.
Adding any kind of character depth or world building or some other literal element, you might take that as an improvement to the story, but actually it makes it less concise. Instead of it being about this emotional tug and pull about the morality of family versus future, you're erasing that and just boiling Hyrule down into any other fantasy world that you would use to escape your adult responsibilities. The point is instead to take these morals to heart and apply them to your adult life. Stories, like stories in general, are not escapism. They're meant as therapeutic life advice. As we're going to get into, the themes and emotions in the Wind Waker and all of these games were deeply personal to Eiji Aonuma. It's not an optional thing. If you're someone who emotionally connects with a story from any video game or book or movie, chances are good there's an auteur behind it. And it's your obligation as a member of the audience to identify and understand that person, because stories, real stories, are merely an extension of the storyteller themselves. Creativity is a uniquely human quality that can't be replicated by any studio, and certainly not by a company. I'm going over many interview quotes later, of course, but you don't have to know the entire history of things to understand that Eiji Aonuma is the originator for these story concepts. That much is self-evident if you simply read one or two interviews, because he's the one that always gives detailed and lengthy answers to story questions, talking about things that he could only know if he was.
Tetra allows Link to get on board the pirate ship, and by this point you've probably figured out that she's Zelda. In Ocarina of Time they pulled this trick as well, but it was far more unexpected because Sheik was so different from how you would imagine Zelda to be, and because they hadn't had a twist like that before. Nobody who played Ocarina was about to be fooled twice. It's not a big deal, but it begs the question of why they even bothered, or why they didn't try to do something a bit different. This is a tough balance to maintain, however, and after the complaints from some people that Majora's Mask and the Wind Waker were too different, it was probably inevitable that Nintendo would eventually produce something too close to the Ocarina of Time mold. Back in the days of Ocarina and Majora, Nintendo clearly didn't care about crafting an overarching timeline for the Zelda series.
Matt's entire brand as a channel is that he makes in-depth reviews, but here he's showing that he's never actually read a single interview, or he'd know this.
Overall, the references to the Hero of Time and all that stuff feel pretty forced. Its attempts to continue on from Ocarina of Time seem incredibly half-assed and not very well thought out. Then that's a pretty terrible fate in and of itself.
What Matt is really trying to say is that he believes that there's no way Aonuma could have possibly cared or kept track of all these things, but as I'm gonna show, Aonuma absolutely did keep track of the details. Speaking of details, let's look at another character who has his true identity revealed to him.
This section of the game is where the Zant stuff finally goes off the rails. He had only been seen rarely before this point, but he was shown to be a restrained and creepy villain who managed to be pretty intimidating. Had they kept this up, he could have easily substituted as Ganon for the game's main villain. Zant's character is flushed down the drain in the space of a minute, and it turns out he's just another boss to defeat on the path to the real villain, Ganon. I don't think there was any point to establishing Zant as a villain at all if he was going to be replaced at the end of the game with Ganondorf.
I'm not going to harp on it too much right now, but you should at the very least understand that all fictional characters are nothing more than metaphors, and they are, in fact, at the disposal of the larger story.
Freewheeling, aggressive pirate, strained and creepy villain who... It's as though Tetra was just a vessel to be overwritten. Zant's character is flushed down the drain.
This isn't a flaw, it's just how stories have been told for thousands of years. A fun, unique side character is never going to take precedent over the larger story, and there's no reason for them to need to unless you're just stating your opinion as though it were fact.
I'm glad that Zelda, Ganon and Hyrule are all absent from Majora's Mask, because after Ocarina of Time, there was no need to revisit Hyrule and no story to be told there. Any direct sequel would need to be told somewhere else in order not to weaken the impact of the events in Ocarina.
Exactly zero of this is a theory or speculation. The only way that anyone could miss important details like this, like Tetra obviously always being Zelda, or Zant obviously always being Ganondorf's heir, is by completely missing the intended reading of the text, which you can either do unintentionally, because you misunderstand the story at face value, or intentionally to mislead people even though you actually do understand the overarching story. Now, which one does Matt fit into? You might be shocked.
According to the story, the world was formed by three goddesses who are also responsible for creating the Triforce. This story has no bearing on the game in the slightest and could have been swapped out with any mystical backstory you could think of. We don't get any reason why the Triforce itself would exist, just that it was left behind after they were gone. These events are so far removed from the things that actually happen in the game that they might as well have not been included. I'm all for fleshing out the world, but this doesn't tell us anything about Hyrule or any of the people living in it that we didn't already know. It just confirms that some goddesses made the world, not a big deal.
Now, I could nerd about this, but then he skips over the part where Zelda recaps it later. And then when Ganon seizes the Sacred Realm, like they had been talking about the entire time, he says this.
The Ocarina of Time opens up the Temple of Time, where the game will skip forward 7 years into the future. There's a bit of an unnecessary cutscene where Ganon tells how this was his plan all along, blah blah blah, and then a bit more exposition.
Just as it was in Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, none of this stuff is optional to the story of Ocarina of Time. Matt wants to have his cake and eat it too, where he can ignore the story, because according to him it doesn't matter, but then when the story reaches a climax, and suddenly all of those things do gain relevance, suddenly it's this weird thing that comes out of nowhere. The truth is, it never came out of nowhere. Matt just wasn't paying attention. Like, check this one out.
But this is just one element of a much larger game, and regardless of how you feel about the visuals, it's worth considering how well the Wind Waker stands up as a Zelda game, and as a game in general. It starts out on the appropriately named Outset Island with
No, it doesn't start on Outset Island. I mean, you know full well that it doesn't. This intro explains all the supposed problems that Matt has with this story, and this is on the GameCube version where you can't even skip the cutscenes, so you've had to deliberately edit that footage out of your recording. I can't believe people take this guy seriously when he thinks that he can make a 40-minute video claiming to have some kind of insight on The Legend of Zelda, meanwhile every single blasted thing he says about this story doesn't contain any information in it. Matt, not only are you missing the entire point of the whole story, you're doing it on purpose. You know what the story is. You've proven that you know.
We're told that Ganon has basically won. He's got his hands on the Triforce and took over the Sacred Realm. Link got sealed away for 7 years so he could grow old enough to take him on. From here on out, most of the game is played as adult Link in the future, and it's a great idea for the plot. In most action-adventure style games that revolve around saving the world, you're given some idyllic place that needs protection, or a post-apocalyptic world where the struggle of the people compels you to try and help them. Either of these scenarios can only be so effective because we're left wondering about what exactly it is we're trying to prevent, or what exactly it is we're trying to restore. As soon as you walk into Hyrule Town 7 years on, Ocarina of Time has answered both of these questions. You have an immediate comparison in your mind of what Hyrule should look like, and what it does look like now.
You have very good reading comprehension. Just because from Tetra's point of view all of this is mysterious, that doesn't mean the player doesn't know who Zelda is. Tetra wasn't alive 100 years ago. She obviously doesn't know who Zelda is. That doesn't mean that this moment is out of character. We, the audience, do know who Zelda is. Her name's on the title screen. The only reason you wouldn't apply this logic to the Wind Waker is if you were being deliberately disingenuous to serve your opinion.
You have an immediate comparison in your mind of what Hyrule should look like, and what it does look like now. The game doesn't even take place in Hyrule, not as we know it anyway. What Hyrule should look like. The game doesn't even take place in Hyrule, not as we know it anyway. What Hyrule should look like, and what it does look like now. Not as we know it anyway. And what it does look like now.
But as previously established, the moral at the end of The Wind Waker is that you should accept the past for what it is and build a better future. Twilight Princess, being an alternate ending to the story, is now inverting that moral. Now, Link is the one protecting his heritage and saving his family, and Ganondorf is the one creating a future for himself in spite of his past. The shoe's on the other foot, but interestingly, Ganondorf is still in the wrong. And that's actually the thematic purpose behind the timeline. So how does Aonuma pull this off? Well, Zant is the key here. Notice that Zant doesn't have to beg Ganondorf for powers or anything. Ganondorf actually comes up to Zant. Let's think about this for 2 seconds. Why Zant? Well, Zant must be special, right? Remember how Tetra is the next Zelda after her mother? Well, here, Zant is the heir to the Lost Gerudo Patriarchy. He's the third male Gerudo after Groose. Once again, this stuff would be totally obvious if Matt simply read the text on screen. You know, thank God it's actually on screen this time. If this was really a retrospective, like it says in the title, wouldn't it contain information that Matthew would only have access to in retrospect? You know, like an art book that explains the story in black and white detail? But no, just to make sure he's been contrarian to every single point made by Hyrule Historia, since that's the true reason he made these videos, he's going to insist that Zant was always supposed to be the main villain of Twilight Princess. With no evidence, mind you. I mean, seriously? I mean, I'm not trying to be mean, but you don't have to make fun of these videos. They just make fun of themselves.
It may be a case they only made this decision because they knew many players would be replaying the game and thus would be ready for hard mode, but I hope they seriously consider this for the next Zelda. At the end of the game, you're taking on multiple Darknuts at once, who do several hearts of damage if they manage to connect.
There's a concerted effort by Matt to overgeneralize and downplay everything, not just the story. He's constantly acting like he's too good for the game. And if that's how you feel about video games, that they should have to earn your attention and respect, you know, that's a matter of personal taste. You can like whatever you want. But don't delude yourself into thinking that attitude makes you superior to everyone else. Now, like I said, most fans these days already know most of this. Matthew is a huge outlier. But at the end of the day, even the fans who are aware just aren't seeing the bigger picture. So we need to keep zooming out. And there's a huge prerequisite before you can truly appreciate Twilight Princess as the first proper revision to Zelda's chronology.
Oh man. Yeah, I think this is going to be a fun playthrough. Anyone here never see this? Also, thank you for the host, Mike. Hi, everybody. Oh, so there's a lot of people who have never played this game. I think you'll enjoy this. This is going to be one of those playthroughs I think you might remember for a little while. Not because of me, but because of the game. It's just one of those games. So, really nice look at the world. For anyone who's getting Legend of Zelda vibes, it's a pretty damn different game, aside from just a couple of visual similarities and sword. And horse, and bridge, and castle. And bow, and climbing. Oh, and Zelda is in this. And Link. And Epona. And Ganon. Alright, I'll stop.
Eiji Aonuma is intentionally pulling from Fumito Ueda in multiple important points in Twilight Princess. In Skyward Sword, and even as early as The Wind Waker, Ico itself was in large part a love letter to Ocarina of Time, so the correct way to interpret all of this is as a reciprocation. Two artists coming to an emotional agreement about something. They're bouncing ideas off of each other and making little notes in the margins. The big one that I always point to is this one, the spiral staircase inside the tower. Aonuma's making you think about Yorda from Ico, and he wants you to compare Yorda in that game to Zelda's role in this game. A pale, fragile girl hiding in the shadows. This is exactly why Ganondorf's first phase is fighting Zelda as a puppet.
娘应该无意识，娘谁困就是썩 희녀사시 이워콘스
이워듀라이 르르도 레카킬로 이니엄
We already knew that Ganondorf was capable of shape-shifting, but this part of the fight takes his abilities to a whole nother level. The very same magic that got the Garuda banished to the Twilight Realm in the first place. They're not exactly subtle about this either.